Hey everybody, I'm Pam Matthews with IEBA, and this is the 5th installment of Terms and Conditions. So 2020 is going to be extra special for lots of reasons. Let me get started by introducing everyone on the panel. So I'm welcoming back attorneys Berkeley Reinhold, Jason Bernstein, and Tim Epstein, and then also with Anderson Benson, Brent Daughtry. So welcome. Okay,
hello.
Yeah, so I'm going to do the standard, this is not legal advice. And I'm also going to suggest that you should consult an attorney who specializes in live entertainment. As Tim likes to say, your mortgage broker or your divorce attorney is not helpful to you in these situations. Okay, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time and jump right in. Is it fair to say that most conversations that are surrounding COVID era insurance and offers and contracts revolve around obligation to perform? Is that a fair statement? Who would like to start us off? Berkeley?
Sure. Yeah, I would say that. I would say the main issue that I'm dealing with right now is building into offers and contracts cancellation rights and what constitutes a force majeure as far as reduced capacity, low ticket sales, maybe a promoter having a fear of putting on an event, notwithstanding the governor or the state allowing the event. And those are the main issues that I'm tackling right now.
So, and before I go to Tim and to Jason on this one, I just want to throw in one little more part. Is a guarantee of health any intention of indemnification? Like, is a guarantee of health even a conversation?
We will say that it isn't. I mean, anytime you go out in public, there's a risk of contracting it. And I think we saw Disneyland has put up notices, and we'll try to have warnings and disclaimers in the ticketing process, but there's no way that you can completely prevent this. If you go out, there's a chance you're going to get sick, and we can't expect any promoter or any artist or any venue operator to guarantee safety. We can use safe practices, but even the president acknowledges it's airborne, so there's only so much we can do.
So Brent, I'm going to pull you in. Can you indemnify against COVID?
It's a tough one. I'm going to say, overall, no. From a liability standpoint, if you look at it, everybody uses ISO forms, which stands for the Insurance Service Office. And most ISO forms in the CGL, Commercial General Liability, has, exclusions, potentially communicable disease, potentially pandemic, but also like the key factors in the CGL form is, and with coronavirus, is there's no legal liability. And again, you've got to have the wrongdoer has to be found guilty of negligence in order for liability to come into play. Can an artist or a promoter or an agency, protect themselves in the event of a cancellation? Potentially. The London market's getting a lot harder, even releasing communicable disease terms. There's some COVID options, but it's very limited, sub-limited, and expensive. So I think from a liability side, again, you've got to prove negligence and for it to respond. So my answer is no.
Does anyone disagree with that answer?
I'll chime in here. I wouldn't necessarily say that I disagree with that. When we talk about indemnification, we talk about various parties' contractual obligations and rights and what they're able to do vis-a-vis each other. So if a promoter says to an artist, I'm going to indemnify you for any risk to COVID should you perform here, then if there is a lawsuit brought by a third party, that's going to claim damages related to COVID, then you're basically making sure that that artist is not going to be on the hook for any damages or defense costs that may result from that claim. But to Brent's point, it's very difficult right now to get insurance to be able to serve as a backstop for indemnification obligations that you put into those contracts, whether that be on a liability basis found in a CGL policy or on a cancellation basis or on a non-appearance policy. Generally, it's difficult to get coverage for communicable disease regardless. It's usually excluded, something you have to endorse over usually or get removed altogether. But since COVID was identified as a risk worldwide on the insurance markets, it really is something that people have not been able to get coverage for on a liability or cancellation or non-appearance basis. There are some people trying to put forth efforts to fill that gap because there are events happening even if there's no fans there, largely because there's media and broadcast dollars involved and we're talking about sports. But any of the leagues that are moving forward or conferences that are moving forward on the sports side, largely that is moving forward with a gap in coverage for cancellation related to COVID.
Yeah,
so
and
risk that they're taking.
we are seeing a lot of that in the agency language. They're trying to put that indemnity obligation on the promoter. As a promoter, I would certainly push back on that. And everything Tim said is 100% correct. The other thing is it's very hard to prove. How would you prove who was at fault and did the person actually get COVID at the event? So I think there are so many variables there, and given what everybody just said about insurance, I would push very strongly back on that contractual request if an agency puts it in your deal.
So thank you. So let's go back to that. Are a lot of the conversations, you mentioned conversations with agencies, are a lot of the conversations about obligation to perform? Jason?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
You know, I'm been talking with all the major agencies as well as, you know, some of the smaller ones lately. We want to make offers. We want to go forward and do shows, but, you know, legally, especially everyone knows COVID is out there. So if we just issue a normal contract and something goes wrong or things go backward or there's a resurgence, people say, well, you took that risk, you knew about it, and it's not unexpected. So the main conversations that we've been having revolve around the fact we want to make offers, but if there's a resurgence, we need the ability to pull the show down without a penalty. And we're definitely getting some pushback, but what I've explained and a lot of people understand is if we don't have a backstop or some form of safety net, then we just have to, you know, put our hands in our pockets, close our checkbooks, and wait until it's completely safe, which means it'll be probably 4 to 6 months after all the restrictions are lifted. And that just doesn't make sense. Right. So we're talking, and, you know, most people get it. I think the biggest question that's arisen is, would we be reasonable in how we exercise it? And, you know, we're not making offers with the goal of canceling a show. We just want to be able, I'm finding more and more often, the local public officials are under a lot of pressure economically that they don't want to cancel anything. So we have to be able to exercise, you know, sound judgment.
I'm also seeing, you know, from Jason and others that, you know, they're pushing, which, you know, I mean, I get it, you know, trying to push as much cost off on the artist as possible. You know, there's talk of, you know, guarantees going away somewhat. But what I'm finding in the contracts that I'm currently reading is, you know, even adverse weather. It used to be ready, willing, and able to perform. You know, now they're even putting that in there that if you're there and it's canceled due to weather, you know, we're not paying you. So I'm seeing a lot more from, you know, the promoter side, adding a lot more endorsement, these items that would be endorsements on a non-appearance or cancellation policy that we haven't seen in the past. which if they were ready, willing, and able in the past, most of the time they would get paid by the promoter.
Yeah,
So-
and I think,
Go,
go ahead,
Jason.
I'm sorry. Well, I was going to say part of that is sort of like when there's big earthquakes in California. For a period of time, it's just hard to get any insurance because they're not writing it. So we still have the position, if it's a normal weather issue, we're not going to cover it. Typically we don't. There have been some exceptions. But you know, if we're giving refunds to patrons, that's where that money's going. If we have a torrential downpour for a few hours, but it's not to the point that we're giving refunds, then the artists are still going to get paid in full, whether they performed or not. It's just, if we're in a situation where we're giving refunds, we're probably not going to have the insurance coverage. So that would be the time where we don't cover it.
I think there's a big opportunity there for smaller promoters, because it is true that the larger promoters are shifting and putting the burden of weather cancellation onto the artist. And if you're a smaller festival or smaller event and you are able to get coverage for weather at a reasonable cost, I think that it's a good point to negotiate with the agency, because it's not something that they'll be getting from the bigger promoters anymore.
So I'll add to that. This week, I had conversations with the legal team of two of the largest agencies, and that's what they're discussing is what they can pick up on a blanket basis and maybe cover for on the artist's behalf, and or have it easily available to their clients. So I think these happened this week multiple times. So they're really diving into, hey, look, we might take this on the chin and purchase the adverse weather and or these other segments of the cancellation on appearance policies for our artists. So
let me just make sure I heard that correctly. Did you just say that two major agencies said they would consider taking out coverage on behalf of their artists to protect against non-performance? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Okay.
So specifically, the conversation was specific around the adverse weather piece. But then, there's multiple others, the civil commotion. Now London has put a Black Lives Matter exclusion in the Lloyd's form. So, there's so many variables right now. And so they're just, I think like everybody, they're grasping for information, trying to figure out what's the right way to pivot. Like, what do we do? How can we look good as an agency to protect our clients and maybe give them value too? Like, we're going to cover this for you. So I think there's just a lot of just open discussions.
So let's move to that question. In the COVID era, what kind of policy should I have, and what should my offers and contracts include? Like, if you can, like the top 3 or 4 most important things that it should include.
To me?
I defer to the insurance guy, Brent.
Okay.
Yeah, it's tough, kind of like, what Tim was saying, everybody's saying. The difficult thing is you can't indemnify for COVID. So,
okay.
What can you do? Is really have your touring policy, your commercial general liability, your hired and non-owned, your excess, your workers' comp, all that in place. And then just hopefully, the waiver thing is, waivers never win in court, but it's a damn good, defense, I think. So, I think you've got to have your contracts and your attorney. I'll let the attorneys chime in on that, but you've got to have that just zip tied to where your client's not held liable for something that they're not in control of.
Yeah.
And I would say the cancellation, like if we make an offer now for June the 15th, 2021, and we can't play that, this is the question that I get. I would like to make an offer but don't have a crystal ball. So Jason, you were
Yeah.
teed.
Well, I was going to say,
Jason, go.
we're putting in provisions. So if we just make our own decision based on how we feel and what we think the safety risks are, we'll do that by, say, 60 days out from the festival. So hopefully an artist hasn't incurred a lot of hard costs on that. But at the same time, there's the reality that if too many shows go down,
Right.
they've got weekly nuts to cover and touring costs. And so it has to be a conversation and a discussion. On a festival, those are anchor dates. And are we going to push a festival 6 months out? Or I saw Bonnaroo just moved from June to September. So I don't think with COVID, I don't think it's going to happen in isolation or just in one city or state. I think it'll at least be regionally, if not nationally. So if you lose, say it's Coachella or Firefly or one of the other shows, if that goes away, that whole geographic area is probably knocked out. So do you just push everything back like we did this year or what? It's hard to say. But, I think the biggest thing is we want to communicate as far in advance. No one wants to make a decision the week of the show because everyone's incurring costs. And I think flexibility is a key issue.
Tim?
So one of the things we've done on an offer basis is to bifurcate it and to say, here's our June date, here's our September date, hold both those dates, and then have the schedule back up relative to each of those dates. So deposit schedule, radius clause, all of the things that are relative to a certain date, those are going to back up relative to which date goes. Now, which date's going to go, that's where you have the different factors in relative to COVID. If I have capacity restrictions that have not been lifted by a certain date, if I have there's no ability to put on the event because the venue's closed because it's been ordered closed for COVID reasons, whatever it may be, those benchmarks are in place relative to a date that may affect announce, it may affect deposit schedule, but all of that goes relative to what date the performance is actually going to take place. Because what we can't have is everyone sitting around waiting for the specific government order to extend to a certain time period. Because to all of these local officials who have elections and have constituents who want to make sure things are open, they're not canceling things for the indefinite future. They're waiting until it gets to a certain time point where they have to say things can't happen. So the more difficult part, the soft part about this from a benchmark standpoint is capacity issues. And so you can say capacity restrictions, but getting to an agreement with an agent on what a capacity restriction means to you versus them is difficult because the agent isn't necessarily privy, particularly on a soft ticket play, to how much you're going to make, because a lot of it goes down to guarantee. It's not a door deal. So the agent doesn't necessarily have the insight into exactly what you're going to make on a per ticket basis. And so when they say, well, why don't you just do the festival if it's 80%, clearly you can make money on that. They don't know. And also what we have seen is that we're concerned about, from a promoter standpoint, what's your food and beverage sales going to look like? Are those going to be severely restricted because someone doesn't want to have a mask on and then go up and buy a beer? Are they going to want to wait in line and miss the show? How many are they actually going to drink because they have the mask on? So a lot of other ancillaries may go down while there's still restrictions in place relative to masking, which goes to dollar amounts that they may make. When you do it on a per person basis and you talk about capacity, those are a lot of factors that the agent may not be privy to, that a promoter will have to educate the agent on to get room for negotiation if we're going to talk about a lower guarantee related to capacity.
If we get to a situation where we're talking about an 80% capacity, I think almost every person watching this would be thrilled. We didn't see things drop. No one has said you can do 90% capacity. It's been you can do 10% or 20%. So I think, we'll probably see with smaller shows, and I think watching the sports leagues will tell us a lot about capacities and what works. And Yeah, we sometimes refer to guinea pig states as different ones open. Like Florida has basically lifted a whole bunch of their restrictions. Doesn't really work for the live industry because they're still at 50%. But a lot of people anticipate what we think will happen. But if we're all wrong and it turns out that it's mild and there's not a big resurgence, that would be great news. And I think that will also tell us what's happening and, you know, what capacities can safely operate at.
So the other hot topic that I've been dealing with in addition to reduced capacity is if the events can take place and if the capacity hasn't been reduced, the risk of having low ticket sales because people are maybe afraid to come out. And it's a really difficult point to negotiate because how do you know that the people aren't coming because it's related to COVID versus maybe just your marketing campaign? And that type of risk is usually on the promoter. So, you know, what do you do? Do you build into your deal if you feel that ticket sales aren't doing well because of COVID, you can issue a kill fee certain dates out, even if the capacity hasn't been reduced?
What are the things that we need to put into the offers and contracts? Language that makes government restrictions, including a reduced capacity, force majeure. Can a reduced capacity be force majeure? What if there is a restriction on or a prohibition on camping? How does that affect? So like, are we writing that into the contract? Are we writing provisions that account for 5-hour admissions and testing and all the costs associated with that? What are we doing with ready, willing, and able? I think Brent touched on that. If an artist is uncomfortable, but are they getting paid? Tell me about some of the things that we're writing into offers and contracts.
We're definitely putting in, if there's capacity restrictions or adverse admission procedures that would constitute a force majeure.
Okay.
Obviously, like I said, we're putting out offers with the goal of doing the show. So even if there are those kinds of things, if we can find a way to do the show and have it make money and do it safely, we have every incentive in the world to go forward. But if it's not safe or just financially, one example I've mentioned to people is if we can be at full capacity, whether it's a festival or a concert, but you have to have the audience come in and staggered admissions, for an Elton John show 5 hours early. I don't think that's going to fly. And I don't think the agent or the artist is probably going to want that. So we would, call that under force majeure. If it's something where we can do Coachella at full capacity, but we have to give a rapid test that takes 15 minutes and is an extra $20 a head, that's a huge number. So that would impact us. If we're not allowed to have camping, that means 30% of the people don't have a place to stay, and it's an impracticality. So hopefully we'd know that ahead of time. But with all of that, our goal is to do the show. So we're only going to exercise that right, which we are saying is force majeure, if it's a necessity. I don't think we would just do it for convenience. The other thing that I think is important is we can always argue about how many tickets someone gets or what's their guarantee or the billing, and that can be done artist by artist. But the COVID restrictions have to be, I think, identical across the board, because I can't say, oh, well, this agency's acts are out, this agency's acts are in. It needs to be 100%, either we're doing the show or we're not, at least on a festival. And I think a lot of it's conversation and, it's a lot of discussion just to get everyone comfortable. And I think there's a level of trust that has to exist.
So if I heard you correctly, every act on an event would have a uniform offer. Did I hear you correctly? Okay.
Right. Like what I've explained to people is, and we've had some nuances where we've tweaked the language, but we're doing it across the board. But it basically needs to be a situation where this is our offer. If you like it, accept it. If you don't like that aspect, simply pass, and there won't be any ill will. But we can't have different standards on those issues. And if too many people say no, then we'll hear that message and we'll wait. But otherwise, we need to be able to go forward and have some predictability.
Any other thoughts on that? Uniform across an event?
Yeah, I think the uniform across the event, certainly from an offer standpoint, that goes without saying. The problem is when you get in with the different agencies, we have different sets of terms, whether those be just on the face of the contract and attached terms, or you're talking about a WME or a paradigm that has pre-negotiated terms that you're talking about. The problem is that for a lot of those agencies, you don't put force majeure and various terms that may affect COVID on the face. Those are legal terms that are in the back.
We're actually putting it both on the offer and in the terms and conditions. And like I said, we're being very transparent of if it doesn't work, we respect that. Right. We just can't negotiate it agency by agency on that particular provision.
Right.
But as we get feedback from the agencies, we'll make tweaks, but it's, we send back going, hey, this agency raised an issue, so we've modified it. Here's what we're thinking. And if it works, great. And it's a slow process, but it seems to be working.
Yeah, I think at this point, and I always took the position that whether force majeure should be a business point even before COVID, but even more so now, cancellation terms should be a business point and addressed specifically in the offer. And as everybody just said, 100%, they should be uniform as far as policy across all artists performing on that event.
And I think one of the things is, if you try to do it agency by agency, it wouldn't work anyway, because different attorneys represent a variety of artists, business managers, accountants, finance. So if you try to play around, it's going to come out anyway. And how come this artist of mine has a great situation, this other one's getting burned? Like, we can't operate that way, and I think it would just cause more harm than good. One other thing I wanted to mention, Pam, tying back to what you said about insurance and responsibility for COVID, we are seeing some states have passed legislation that prohibit litigation unless it's gross negligence. And I know in some of the federal things, whether it's the House or the Senate, they're trying to add in some language that would essentially make it, it'd have to be really egregious behavior in order for a lawsuit even to proceed. A lot of that gets political, but I understand the basis for it. And I think it's something we support because, as Berkeley said, even if you get COVID, and even if it's at a super spreader event, you can't prove where any one person actually contracted it.
Right.
So hopefully that'll help a bit.
Yeah. Tennessee did that in a special session.
I get a lot on the artist side. Are my employees covered under workers' comp? And I mean, there's two tests for that, and it is the illness or disease must be occupational, meaning that it arose out of and was in the course and scope of the employment, and the illness or disease must arise out of or be caused by condition peculiar to the work. So are they? Most likely, again, no. But it's an interesting time. I mean, so artists are saying, do I get, waivers from my band and crew saying that, they will not come after me in the case of a COVID event?
Even if everyone on the bus had, tested positive, then in week 2, everybody tested negative, and in week 2, everybody tested positive.
Yeah, I mean, that happened in a recent. There was about 80 people. They went and did a deal, and I think about 74 of them got it. And so I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. It's such a fluid deal. I mean, it's changing every day. Insurance is trying to, Lloyd's and London and each syndicate are trying to evolve with it, but at the end of the day too, these syndicates are in the business of making money, and they're bleeding money right now. So, just covering communicable disease and, writing in COVID-19 coverage, I don't see that'll happen. I think you can buy communicable disease that does have a COVID-19 exclusion. So if there are other diseases in the future that comes forward, kind of think of it as a pre-existing condition. So you can still buy communicable disease. It's limited, but you can get it.
I think most folks who are promoters get their CGL policies on an annual basis. And so for a lot of these folks, they may, for these last, I don't know, call it 6 months of life after COVID or life during COVID, they've had CGL policies that may have had communicable disease coverage on there from a CGL basis, but none of them have gotten sued yet for someone getting sick, largely because none of them put on shows. And so the exposure has not been there, and the tests have not been there from a third-party liability basis. What we are seeing is that there were payouts for some cancellation policies, the biggest example being Wimbledon. And that led to the London markets not wanting to write COVID coverage. But I think when you're seeing CGL policies that are going to be renewed, there's going to be exclusions in there for communicable
For sure.
before.
Yeah.
And even if the endorsement is available, they're not going to allow for the endorsement on COVID. But if I'm an underwriter for a CGL policy, I'm not really concerned about damages, just because the amount of people who actually go to the hospital that are positive, who get sick enough to go to the hospital, and the amount of people who die, and then put that up against the amount of the type of people who are going to shows, I don't think if you do a Venn diagram, there's going to be a whole lot of carryover there, just calling a spade a spade. So if I'm looking at this from an underwriting perspective, I'm not seeing a ton of risk on a damages standpoint, because the far majority of people who get this don't show any symptomologies, or it's very mild. So the real big issue for COVID relative to insurance, I'm sure Brent and everyone else would agree, is on the cancellation market, because that market's simply
Very much so.
exist right now.
Yeah, and Brent brought up a really good point, how the insurance companies, there are only a limited number of underwriters. It's a very small industry, and they're very risk adverse. And I know that this panel is focusing on COVID, and that's obviously the topic right now that's super important, but climate change is really an enormous threat to the live event industry. And with the insurance companies being so risk adverse, you have COVID, but then you have weather, then you have fires, you have, with fracking and earthquakes and hurricanes and tornadoes. And these are things that we are seeing just the tip of the iceberg. I think the industry as a whole really needs to take a look at this very seriously and figure out how it's going to move forward, because at a certain point, I don't know that these insurance companies are going to be offering cancellation insurance like they're doing now for these events outside of COVID. And it's really going to give a huge economic hit to these promoters if they can't insure those risks.
You're exactly right. And what I have been out, really talking about is the major issue in London. And prior to COVID, I was over there, once a quarter or once every 2 months. And, the biggest issue is we've already seen syndicates. So in the entertainment space, there's 3 main syndicates and then 7 follow syndicates. So that make up 100% of the risk. And what you're seeing is there's been a couple already syndicates that have left the market. So is just out of the live entertaining space. So I think the biggest problem that we're going to see from a contingency, which is cancellation non-appearance, going forward is capacity. I mean, there's only so many syndicates. There's only so much capacity to insure. So, we're already looking at ways where, we can pivot and maybe insure from the other side of the house, which is basically like a PTD, permanent total disablement policy, as well as and somehow bridge that onto a contingency policy. But yeah, capacity is going to be a major issue going forward, and I'm with Berkeley. I mean, we'll see. I mean, it's been a bloodbath for them, and it just claims keep happening.
Yeah, I mean, and we're seeing, like, with the fires in California, that smoke is going, clear across literally across the country. I live in Southern California. Sometimes I'm close to them, and there'll be ash or fires in our own neighborhood. Right now, I'm at least 45 minutes away from the closest one, and you can still go outside and you're tasting the smoke. And if you've got a festival that's near a mountain range and everything's going up against that, like, we do want to be intelligent and protect the audience and be safe and be healthy. And I don't think a lot of bands want to be performing either in a torrential downpour or in the middle of something where, their vocal cords are getting shredded by smoke. So, we didn't used to see nearly the volume of cancellations due to thunderstorms and, tornadoes in the middle of the country that we've seen probably the past 5 years. So it's a real issue.
Yeah, I would say in addition to that, where insurance comes in from a contractual basis, when you're negotiating with an agent, particularly on a festival, because most of those are outside, there's going to be requirement language in there for cancellation insurance policies to be procured. Your ticketing policy, your ticketing contract with your ticketing provider may require that you have cancellation coverage. The problem is, and Berkeley mentioned this before, there may not be, and Brennan said, there may not be capacity at all. Forget about limited capacity. It just may not be coverage that gets offered anymore, or at least for a certain period of time. But let's just say the coverage is offered. It has to be commercially reasonable. Right. And a cancellation policy right now used to be you were in good shape if you could get a premium for 1% or 1.5% of your gross.
Yeah.
Now they're looking at, even before COVID, guys were getting quoted at 5%. So even if the promoter is able to risk on their own that they can self-insure for the cancellation,
right?
If a contract with an artist or a ticketing company, or whoever it may be, a municipality requires you to get cancellation coverage, that's money that you're never going to get back. And if it's called 5%, that's a lot of money. And so I think what we need to do as promoters is to let them know that that requirement should not be in there unless there is capacity, unless there is actually a market, and that market is commercially reasonable.
I've actually
that is the truest statement. I love that.
We actually had a contract with that type of a requirement where it said we needed to provide a particular type of insurance or several coverages. And we said, we called out expressly that the parties acknowledge that whatever the particular type of insurance is not available at a commercially reasonable rate and will not be included. To even have that conversation is pretty bizarre. But
it's wild. I mean, yeah, two things that I've seen in there too in agreements is asking for both war and civil war, and also cyber warfare are two items that I'm dealing with currently.
And are those available?
Yeah.
Yes, they are both available. Yeah, I mean, the war and civil war is it has to go to another level of approval, and which is complicated. But we were just able to satisfy an agreement with war and civil war as well as the cyber.
All right, so as our time ticks away, we talked about uniform language for everyone for every artist at an event. What about uniform language for every act at an agency? Is that even possible? Berkeley.
What I do is, for my clients, for my promoters and events, we do usually, to make the process a lot easier, pre-negotiate contract terms. All those additional terms and conditions we have pre-negotiated with each of the major agencies.
Right.
Those terms, even across the agencies, are pretty much the same. The wording might be a little different, but the truth is, in the end, the intent for each of those provisions comes out exactly the same. So there's not a lot of wiggle room there on what an event can agree to, at least in the ones that I work on. So it makes everybody's life easier, and the agencies prefer it to have a document that you can just use every year and not have to renegotiate unless things come up like COVID and weather and things that might have to change.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, yeah, there might be nuances in someone phrases saying differently, but the overall intent is the same. And like you said, if we were trying to play games with it, we'd get called out anyway because of all the other, entities that are associated with an artist's life that, the agencies would get beat up. We'd get beat up as promoters. And, to me, there's no secret in our terms and conditions. When there are new agencies popping up or when we haven't had terms in place, I'll usually just send a few sets to, like when Carl Lewis went and did her thing, I said, here's a few examples. Understand that these are the endpoints, but if you prefer provision 7 from this agreement and 12 from that one, that's fine. Like, it's not really a menu of mix and match. It's just, do you prefer this phrasing over that phrasing? But the intent ends up being the same.
I think it also gives the agencies a sense of assurance, because on their end, to know that the other agencies aren't getting better terms on those types of force majeure and other provisions gives them a safety net, because if their client gets upset, they can say, I'm sorry, but it's the same for everybody.
Okay. As we are moving toward, again, the end of our time, I have two things. One, again, what are the three, I'm going to go to each of the four of you. What are the three things that your clients should be really paying attention to? And then I would like to close with, I believe that communication is going to be key as we go back to live. And then I also wonder, is compromise going to be key as well? So Brent, I'm going to go to you first. What are the three things that everyone, like you need your clients to really pay attention to? And then how are we working in communication and compromise?
Yeah, I mean, for me, again, it just goes back to the contract. And most of my clients have amazing attorneys, like you all, that's in their court. But it's just really reading those agreements and what language is in those, because again, yes, the majors have their set of, contractual deals, but a lot of the independents do not, and it's kind of all over the place. And quite frankly, sometimes I'll look at them and I'm like, they just don't understand the insurance world. They don't understand that this isn't, you can't actually have it. So I think the biggest thing is understanding your contract and what's in there and what you're responsible for and what you're not, because the expense can grow. Like everybody said, the rates are increasing rapidly, quickly. So there could be a lot there. But I mean, I always think, talking about compromise, I think that if we all don't compromise, then we're all out of a job. So, it's like all of us coming to some agreement that, look, these are the items that can be insurable from my perspective. This is what is insurable and this is what's not. So, if you throw these in an agreement, just expect to have that, red line, because it's unattainable. So I think everybody's got to compromise for us all to be successful in the future.
Thank you. Berkeley?
I agree. I think that my conversations with the agencies have been very much in that vein. I think that they understand that they need the promoters just as much as the promoters need them. So yes, there have been certain points that we haven't yet agreed upon, but I think everybody is coming to the table with the intent to make it work. As far as the points you asked for, weather payment, I think, is incredibly important to figure out what your policy is going to be on that and specifically address it. Of course, COVID cancellation, and also liability and how those terms will be managed.
Jason.
I think regardless of whether I'm representing a venue or an artist or a promoter, I would say do not agree to indemnify for COVID. I want to be really clear on what is or isn't force majeure. And like I said, in our case, we're saying capacity restrictions and adverse admission policies. I think the third most important thing, and we didn't really talk about it much, is we are agreeable to following government regulations and laws, but we're not agreeable to automatically following CDC guidelines because they're changing frequently.
Right.
And I think I mentioned to one or two of you, like in Georgia, the governor sued to prevent the mayor from having a mask requirement. So it's a great idea and saying we would try to follow, but I can't contractually commit that I'm going to follow every recommendation because some of them, we're prohibited from. In terms of compromise, yeah, I think we've said for years, on this panel, we can write great contracts. Ultimately, someone's going to pick up the phone and have a conversation. And as long as there's no surprises and people are communicating and having whatever degree of flexibility they're able to, I think that's, as important as anything.
And Tim.
I would say relative to three things, as I'd mentioned at the top of this: conditions on offer deposits, conditions on the offer generally, and pay attention to make sure that your dates are matching up with those conditions. So if you're going to do two different dates that you want the artist to hold, make sure everything is flowing from there, because there's a lot of flow that people don't take into account. They may look at their old offer sheet and just say, all right, we're going to add in another date on there, and then nothing else has changed. And I think that could get them into trouble relative to other benchmarks that happen in the course of fulfilling the obligations of a contract. Force majeure, never thought that we would be in a position to be debating what it means to be ready, willing, and able.
Right.
But apparently, there are a couple artists who think that the definition of able is a little more fluid than those of us on the promoter side might think. So I think we all as an industry need to make sure we come to some consensus on that, and hopefully we don't have to go to a conclusion of a litigation to get there. Also, which others have mentioned, indemnity and liability limitations. Just make sure you're not signing up for something that you can't afford to do, particularly if there's not insurance as a backstop to cover your indemnity obligations that you've agreed to in the contract.
All right. So I'm going to just bookend this with, none of this should be construed as legal advice. And then also, I encourage you, all of us encourage you to seek counsel from someone who understands live events. I hear this from my IEBA members often, is that the university has counsel or the city has counsel, and they may not be well versed in the particulars of this industry. So thank you. And I would say let's do it again next year, because there'll be much to discuss then as well. Okay, thank you guys so much.